Hyde Park is one of the most delightful places in London. It's a beautiful open space, free for the enjoyment of all, filled with trees and ducks and dogs arguing about whatever it is dogs argue about. I don't know, politics probably. But had certain speculative planners got their way, it might have concealed something remarkable indeed. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that in the 1930s tensions were rising in Europe. Economic depression had created mass unrest. Dictators were taking power. Alliances were forming. A touchy gentleman in Germany seemed poised to take his inferiority complex out on the world. It was clear to all that it wasn't a case of if war happened, but when. What was equally clear was that this certainly wasn't going to be over by Christmas. The First World War had introduced the people of Britain to the horrors of air raids. Death from above against which ordinary citizens were seemingly helpless. And in the intervening 2 decades, aircraft technology had improved dramatically. The Spanish Civil War had shown exactly how nightmarish modern air warfare could be. Experts, as well as cultural figures as diverse as H.G. Wells and Walt Disney, warned that air power would be the decisive factor in coming conflicts. As we now know, they were completely right. The world would be devastated by air raids, from bombers to rockets to, ultimately, the atomic bomb. But I'm skipping ahead here. In response to the looming threat, the people of Britain demanded air raid shelters. Not unreasonably. I mean, no one likes getting blown to pieces while going about their daily business. The government and local authorities looked into potential sites for conversion into public shelters. Obviously, though, construction of shelters cost money and required time and manpower. The government were also afraid of what they called shelter mentality, the idea that if people had shelters, they just wouldn't bother coming up to the surface. This policy had its critics, the Daily Worker being particularly vocal on the subject, and on the other side of the political spectrum, Winston Churchill. The one thing that's not limited by government policy, money, manpower, or time is the human imagination. So there was a bit of a fad in the late 30s for proposals for shelter complexes. These were usually envisaged as being placed under parks or squares. The Illustrated London News seems to have been particularly fond of this kind of speculation, and that's where the Hyde Park shelter proposal comes from. It was published in 1938. This would have been a truly massive undertaking, capable of housing tens of thousands of people. It would have been buried far below the park. The proposal included a connection to Hyde Park Corner tube station, and the illustration indicates that the shelter would have been below that. The top layer of the shelter would have consisted of a sand barrier. It was believed at the time that poison gas would be a major weapon in the coming conflict, and so the sand was intended to filter this out. In fact, gas was not heavily used, but the precaution is quite an interesting insight into what people thought at the time. Below that, there would have been a 60-foot concrete barrier. I have to say, in light of this, I don't know why they felt the sand barrier was so necessary. If gas could get through all that concrete and London clay, I don't see how much difference sand was going to make. There were also to be thick concrete walls around the sides of the shelter. Below the concrete barrier, the fun began. The anonymous journalist who devised this imagined 3 levels. The top layer would have housed machinery: generators, air filters, reserves of oxygen and fuel. It seems that this inventor saw this as something with the potential for long-term occupation. There was also to be a hospital on this level, and what the author describes as inward traffic from the city. I assume they mean pedestrians rather than motor vehicles, although one assumes access by emergency vehicles would have been a rather useful thing to have. The second level down would have been the living space, dormitories and canteens. And below that there would have been storage. In the middle of all this was to be a 3-level administration block, which would control everything and provide communication with the outside world. Also on the lower level were transport facilities, and this is where the author really lets their imagination run wild. They imagine new main-line railway tunnels, double-tracked, leading to Paddington, Marylebone, Euston, King's Cross, St Pancras, Waterloo, Charing Cross, and Victoria. These would be equipped with airlocks, again in case of poison gas. This whole latter part seems a bit weird. The plan specifically describes these tunnels as being for outward-bound refugees. Why build such massive accommodation facilities and also such extensive evacuation facilities? Talk about belt and braces. Hyde Park is 142 hectares or 351 acres in area. It is very large indeed. And this shelter was supposed to run under the entire thing. The author imagined it having its own internal railway, to be worked by light electric rail cars. There would be several entrances around the edges, and these would lead into decontamination rooms. Again, the fear of poison gas, very much at the fore. I'm sure it will come as no surprise whatsoever when I tell you that this was never built, nor was it ever considered as a serious proposal. It was really a flight of fancy, the kind of thing that catches the eye, but no one has really thought through. Perhaps the idea that such things were practical even provided some comfort to the public at a time of fear. No matter what they throw at us, we'll be safe, as it were. As I said earlier, there are a lot of features that don't seem to make much sense from an engineering or even a logical standpoint. This whole complex, which would have made Crossrail look like a walk in the park, so to speak, would have to be designed and built in a matter of months. Not only that, but it would have needed miles of electrified railway tunnel and new connections at the mainline stations at a time when the railways were busier than ever. We don't know exactly who threw this design together, but they clearly weren't employed by any official board. When war actually did break out, there would be a scramble to build shelters. Deep-level shelter complexes would be built, but on a much smaller scale than our friend from the Illustrated London News pictured. You can actually tour the one at Clapham South, and indeed that's where a lot of the footage in this video came from. There were other proposals, and I might well cover them in future videos, but I don't think any were quite as crazy as the one below Hyde Park. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do click the like button and subscribe for more oddities, both below and above the ground in London. Thanks as ever to my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. You are the electric rail car to my unfeasibly large Citadel. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.